You're sitting at a fancy restaurant. The lights are low, the table is perfectly set, and the waiter arrives carrying a tiny dish filled with small, shiny black pearls. He gently places it in front of you. "This," he says, "is caviar. You've heard of it your whole life. Movies talk about it, billionaires eat it. It's known as one of the most luxurious foods on Earth." But then a strange thought crosses your mind. What actually is caviar? Those little black pearls look elegant, mysterious, almost jewel-like. But when you finally learn what they really are, the answer is much simpler and much stranger than most people expect. Before we uncover the truth behind one of the world's most famous luxury foods, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep explaining the everyday things people rarely stop to question. Now, back to that tiny dish sitting on the table, because the surprising truth about caviar begins with a misunderstanding that almost everyone has. Most people believe caviar is simply a fancy name for fish eggs. And technically, that sounds correct, but it's also completely wrong. The truth is that not all fish eggs are caviar. In fact, most of them aren't. The word caviar refers to something extremely specific, eggs from a particular type of fish called the sturgeon. Sturgeons are ancient creatures. They've existed for over 200 million years, swimming in rivers and seas long before humans ever appeared. Some species can grow over 6 meters long and weigh more than a small car. But what made them famous isn't their size, it's what they carry inside. Sturgeon eggs are large, delicate, and have a unique texture that bursts gently when eaten. When properly prepared and salted, they become what the world recognizes as true caviar. And this is where the story becomes more interesting. Because those glossy black pearls that people treat like edible jewels are simply preserved fish eggs. That's it. No complex cooking, no secret recipe, just carefully harvested eggs, lightly salted to preserve their flavor and texture. And yet, this incredibly simple food became one of the most expensive ingredients on the planet. But why? Why would something so basic become a symbol of luxury? The answer has less to do with taste and far more to do with history. For centuries, sturgeons lived in huge numbers in places like the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. Rivers connected to these seas were once filled with them. Fishermen could catch massive sturgeons with relatively simple equipment, and inside each fish was something incredibly valuable: thousands of eggs. In fact, a single large sturgeon could produce kilograms of roe. But here's the part most people never hear. For a long time, caviar wasn't luxury food at all. In some places, it was actually considered cheap. In the United States during the 1800s, sturgeon were so common in rivers that their eggs were served in bars, sometimes even for free. Yes, free. Salty caviar was placed on tables much like peanuts or popcorn are today. The reason was simple. The salt made people thirsty, and thirsty customers bought more beer. Back then, no one treated caviar like treasure. It was just another salty snack. But over time, something changed. Sturgeon populations began to decline. Rivers were polluted. Dams blocked their migration routes, and overfishing started reducing their numbers dramatically. Because unlike many fish, sturgeons grow extremely slowly. Some species take 15 to 20 years before they can produce eggs for the first time. That means once populations start shrinking, they take decades to recover. And suddenly, the food that was once common started becoming rare. And rarity has a strange effect on human perception. The rarer something becomes, the more valuable it feels. The more expensive it becomes, the more exclusive it appears. And slowly, caviar transformed from a simple salty snack into one of the world's most prestigious delicacies. But there's another twist to the story, because even today, when people order caviar at a restaurant, many of them believe they're eating something incredibly complex or mysterious. Yet the reality is almost laughably simple. It's still just fish eggs, carefully harvested, carefully salted, served in tiny portions that can cost hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. But what surprises most people isn't just what caviar is, it's how it's actually produced. Because the process behind those tiny black pearls is far more delicate, controversial, and fascinating than most diners ever realize. And once you understand how caviar is truly made, the price tag suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. But the story of how those eggs go from a living fish to a luxury delicacy is where things become even more surprising, and in some cases, a little uncomfortable. That's where the real truth behind caviar begins. But to understand why caviar became so valuable, you have to look at the fish itself, because the sturgeon is not like most fish people are familiar with. A salmon, for example, grows relatively quickly. Within a few years, it can already reproduce. Many fish species follow similar patterns. But the sturgeon lives on a completely different timeline. Some species take 10 years, others 15, and in some cases even 20 years before they produce their first eggs. That means a farmer raising sturgeon has to wait nearly 2 decades before seeing the first real product. And during all that time, the fish still need to be fed, cared for, and protected. Imagine running a business where you invest money for 20 years before you can sell anything. That alone already explains part of the price. But the process doesn't stop there. Because once a sturgeon is finally ready to produce eggs, those eggs must be harvested extremely carefully. Traditionally, the fish was caught and opened to remove the roe, the clusters of eggs inside its body. For centuries, this was the standard method. The eggs were then gently washed, separated, and lightly salted. This step is incredibly important. Too much salt ruins the delicate flavor. Too little salt and the eggs spoil quickly. The balance has to be precise. That's why the best caviar producers rely on highly trained specialists who understand exactly how to handle the eggs without damaging them. Each tiny sphere has a fragile membrane. If handled roughly, they burst. If stored incorrectly, they lose their texture. And if they lose that signature pop when eaten, the caviar loses much of its value. But here's something that surprises most people. The flavor of caviar is actually very subtle. It isn't intensely fishy like many people imagine. Instead, it's usually described as buttery, slightly salty, and almost creamy. The experience isn't just about taste, it's about texture. When the eggs rest on your tongue, they gently burst, releasing a small wave of flavor. That unique sensation is part of what made caviar famous. But even that doesn't fully explain why it became a global luxury symbol. Because the biggest turning point came when sturgeon populations began collapsing. By the late 19th century, decades of overfishing had pushed many sturgeon species dangerously close to extinction. In some regions, they almost disappeared completely. Governments were forced to step in. Strict fishing regulations were introduced. In many places, catching wild sturgeon became illegal. Suddenly, the natural supply of true caviar dropped dramatically, and when something already rare becomes even rarer, its price rises quickly. Today, most caviar in the world doesn't come from wild fish at all. It comes from carefully managed aquaculture farms. These farms raise sturgeon in controlled environments for many years before harvesting the eggs. Some farms even use new techniques that allow the fish to survive the process, carefully extracting the roe without killing the animal. But even with modern technology, the timeline hasn't changed. You still have to wait many years. And that long wait keeps the product rare. This is why a small tin of high-quality caviar can easily cost hundreds of dollars, in some cases, even thousands, especially when it comes from famous varieties like beluga or Osetra sturgeon. But here's another detail most people never hear. Not every expensive caviar you see is actually true caviar. Remember earlier when we said caviar only comes from sturgeon? Well, many products labeled as caviar come from completely different fish. Salmon roe, lumpfish eggs, flying fish roe. They may look similar, they may even taste good, but technically they aren't caviar at all. They're simply fish roe. True caviar is far more specific, and that distinction is part of what maintains its status as a luxury ingredient. So when people sit in a restaurant staring at those small, glossy pearls on a spoon, it can feel like something mysterious or extravagant. But once you understand the story behind it, the reality becomes surprisingly simple. Caviar is not some magical ingredient. It's not a secret recipe. It's not a complicated culinary invention. It's simply the eggs of an ancient fish that grows slowly, lives for decades, and produces something humans eventually decided was worth a fortune. And that's the strange thing about luxury. Sometimes the most expensive things in the world aren't complicated at all. They're just rare. And once people begin associating rarity with prestige, even something as simple as fish eggs can become one of the most famous delicacies on Earth. Because sometimes the simplest things hide the most misunderstood truths.